This is the Mahabharata podcast, episode 30, Rshyashrnga. Last time, we followed the Pandavas as they began their grand tour of the holy places. With the sage Lamasha as their guide, the travelers were regaled with stories of the famous hermits associated with these sites. At one location, they came across the hermitage of the famous hermit Agastya, and so we heard the story of Agastya and his wife. The group then wandered onwards until they reached a sacred ford on the river Kaushiki. As they arrived at this new destination, Lamasha pointed out the hermitage had once been inhabited by Kashyapa and his mutant son, Rshyashrnga. Kashyapa was one of those hardcore ascetics who lived by a lake in the woods and had not laid an eye on a woman in years. One day, while he was bathing in the lake, the Apsara Urvashi appeared and took a naked dip in the lake. The sight was more than the old sadhu could bear, and he blew his wad right there in the lake. This seed was so potent that a female deer drinking at the shoreline suddenly conceived and gave birth to a mutant, a baby with a single antelope horn growing from his forehead. Kashyapa adopted this boy as his son and named him Rshyashrnga. The strange boy grew up in the woods with his holy father, perfectly innocent of humanity. Around this same time, the king of Anga, named Lomapada, had offended some Brahmins, and they had left his kingdom in a huff. After their departure, all rain ceased within Lomapada's borders. The drought was relentless, and famine threatened. King Lomapada hired some consulting Brahmins to advise on how to get the rains to come. The advisors told him that as long as these Brahmins held a grudge, there would be no rain. They offered one way out, however. They told the king about the hermit's son, Rshyashrnga. They said, "Fetch this boy, for he is a forest child, ignorant of women, and devoted to virtue. If this hermit lives in your realm, the rains will surely come." The king then summoned his advisors to devise a plan for retrieving the special boy. When they learned he was an adolescent who had never even seen a woman, the solution seemed obvious. The king called on the madam from his favorite brothel and assigned her the task of enticing this boy away from the forest. The courtesan only requested that the king build a boat with an authentic hermitage built on it. It looked just like a regular hermitage, with grass and trees and huts, but the trees were all of the finest fruit trees and the huts were decked with flowers. The courtesan floated the boat to Kashyapa's lake and then sent her witty daughter to approach the innocent boy. The clever girl waited until Kashyapa had wandered off to starve himself in a cave, and then approached Rshyashrnga. The girl greeted Rshyashrnga as if she were a fellow ascetic. Rshyashrnga observed, "You seem to glow, sir. I do not know you, but you are welcome. Pray tell me, what kind of vow are you observing, and where is your camp? Please have a seat and allow me to wash your feet." The girl answered, "My hermitage is far from here, but there we do not greet each other this way, nor do we use water to wash our feet." The boy said, "Well, at least allow me to offer you something to eat. We have roots, nuts, and berries. Which do you prefer?" The girl turned him down again, saying, "We have much better food at our place. Try this." She offered the boy pastries and curries from the king's kitchens, washed down with the finest wine. The boy couldn't believe there were such beautiful Brahmins who had such delicious snacks. The girl began dancing and playing. She draped colorful scarves over Rshyashrnga's shoulders and allowed her own clothing to fall loose. She giggled, stole kisses, and danced around. Just as the boy was getting uncontrollably excited, she gave the boy a hug and told him she had an Agnihotra sacrifice to attend to, and skipped off into the woods. Rshyashrnga was beside himself with longing and confusion. When his strange visitor departed, he no longer had any appetite for roots and nuts. Water could not quench his thirst. He just sat and dreamed of his new friend. Sometime later, the boy's father returned to the camp and was surprised to see the boy just moping around while the cows had wandered off and the firewood was used up. Kashyapa asked him, "You don't seem to be yourself, son. What is troubling you?" The boy replied, "A fellow student came by today who had braided hair. He was not large, and he had the brightest eyes I've ever seen. On his chest he had 2 globes of flesh, and he had no hair on his chest. It was most beguiling. His waist was pinched, but his hips were full. He had little bells on his ankles and wrists, and when he moved, they made a musical sound. His voice was like the cuckoo's song, and it disturbed me somehow when he spoke. As I watched him, father, I felt great joy and love. He embraced me again and again, and pulling my head lower, he placed his mouth upon mine and made a sound that begot great pleasure in me. He would not eat our food, but the food he had was like nothing I've ever eaten. His fruits were much sweeter than ours, and they had no skin or pits. He gave me a liquid to drink that was very flavorful, and as soon as I drank, surpassing joy seized a hold of me, and the earth seemed to sway. Since he left, I have been beside myself, and my body feels anxious. I want to go back to him straight away. I would like to join his hermitage and study with my new friend every day." The old man grew serious. He said, "These are demons, my son. They assume these beautiful shapes and wander the earth in order to distract us from our practices. Those drinks were evil liquors which are cherished by the wicked folk, but are forbidden to the faithful." Rshyashrnga listened to his father obediently, but he still could not shake his infatuation with his new friend. He used every excuse to wander off and search for this fabulous ashram that must contain his friend. After a few days of fruitless searching, Kashyapa once again set out for penance in the woods, leaving the boy to tend the camp. Later that day, the courtesan made another visit. The boy was rapturous to see her again, but he feared his father might return and find them together. He said quickly, "Let's go to your ashram before my father returns." This was just what the girl wanted to hear, and she led Rshyashrnga to her floating ashram, moored on a river. Once the boy was on the barge, he was quickly led indoors, where they entertained him with dancers and baked goods. Being unfamiliar even with boats, he did not notice as the boat was unmoored and floated downstream right into the kingdom of Anga. The king had planned ahead of time, and so the boat was moored on one of his game parks, and the river bank was made up to look like a hermitage. Shortly after arriving in this parched land, the rains finally came. King Lomapada had success in ending the drought in his kingdom, but now he had to worry about what Rshyashrnga's father might do when he found out what had happened. Since he wasn't a greedy man, he did the best a king could do in such a situation. He gave the boy his own daughter to marry, and made him a prince, and advertised to his subjects that this boy had ended the drought. The boy's father had not wasted a moment once he discovered that Rshyashrnga had run off. When he worked out that the king of Anga had abducted his son and had subjected him to temptation and gluttony, he resolved to burn the whole kingdom in retaliation. As Kashyapa crossed into the lands of Anga, he had a difficult time traveling. The lands had all been put to the plow. Even the roads were plowed and planted, and were springing with verdant new crops. The peasants, however, all greeted him warmly and gave him generous hospitality. Wondering at their courtesy and prosperity, he asked them, "Good men, who is your landlord?" His hosts bowed humbly and said, "All this wealth is due to your son's generosity." Everywhere he went, the common folk praised his son for the wealth and good fortune they had experienced since his arrival. All the kind words and hospitality cooled Kashyapa's anger, so that he was feeling pretty good by the time he made it to the palace. At the palace, he was greeted by the king, and then introduced to his new daughter-in-law, the Princess Shanta. It didn't hurt that Kashyapa's grandson would one day be king of Anga, so the hermit blessed the arrangement. He instructed Rshyashrnga that once he had produced a son for the crown, he should return to his father in the forest and resume an ascetic's life. After some years, Shanta gave birth to a son, handed him over to the palace, and departed with her husband for the forest. There Rshyashrnga resumed his old way of life, and Shanta loyally served him. Lamasha said, and Shanta religiously waited on him, as the lucky Arundhati waits on Vasishta, as Lopamudra attends on Agastya, as Damayanti did on Nala. So did Shanta obey Rshyashrnga there in the woods. The Pandavas pressed onwards with their great pilgrimage, apparently continuing eastward to the region around Kalinga. Among their stopovers, they took a ritual dip in the Vaitarani River. There, as Yudhishthira entered the waters, he exclaimed, "The second I have entered the water, I felt like I transcended the earthly plane. I have a complete view of all the worlds." I once made the hike on foot to the headwaters of the Yamuna River, high up in the Himalayas, at a place called Yamnotri. There's a hot spring and a temple to the goddess. Since we were foreigners, we were sent out to the Untouchables bath. I remember the water was scaldingly hot, but I failed to have any transcendental visions. But still, it was a fantastic adventure. As for the Pandavas, they continued eastward until they reached the sea altar, which I presume was on the shore of the Bay of Bengal. There they greeted a mixed crowd of sadhus. These ascetics came from various schools, including Bhrigus, Angirasis, Vasishtas, and Kashyapis. Yudhishthira greeted each, and then addressed a leader among them, who was of the Rama school. This isn't the Rama of the Ramayana. Rather, it refers to the famous Brahmin Rama Jamadagni. He is perhaps more well known as Parashurama, which I'm told translates roughly to Battle Axe Rama. Obviously, Yudhishthira knew all this already, but he asked this student of Rama's to tell him more about the hero's background. The ascetic told him that Rama himself comes around to visit about twice a month. Yudhishthira then asked, "You're a follower of the powerful son of Jamadagni, so tell me, how were all the Kshatriyas defeated by Rama in battle?" The story began with a Brahmin of Bhrigu descent named Ruchika Bhargava. This Brahmin managed to win the hand of a Kshatriya princess in marriage. At their wedding, the Bhrigu elder blessed the bride with a son for both herself and her mother, who was still young. His only instruction was that the couple should each hug a tree, an Ashvata tree for her and an Udumbara tree for him. Unfortunately, the pair of tree huggers got their varietals mixed up and they each hugged the wrong tree. The result of this error was that the Brahmin's son would be warlike, while his Kshatriya mother-in-law would have a priestly son. They went back to the elder and begged to undo the error. All he could do was delay their fate by putting off the warlike son for one generation. Her son would be a normal Brahmin, but her grandson would be a warrior. Ruchika's son was named Jamadagni, and he grew up to be the joy of the Bhargavas, surpassing his peers in Vedic learning and the science of warfare. Jamadagni also married a Kshatriya princess named Renuka. Renuka gave birth to 5 sons. The first 4 were average, but the youngest, Rama, outshone them all. Many years later, when the boys were presumably adolescents, Renuka went out to gather fruit. Along the way, she came across the king Chitraratha of Mritikavati, who was playing at the river with his wives. Now let me quote directly from the translation what happens next. It says, "When she saw the king playing in the water with his wives, Renuka coveted him. From this bad thought she wetted herself mindlessly in the water and returned trembling to the hermitage. Her husband found her out, and seeing that she had lapsed from constancy and had lost her Brahmanic beauty, the powerful and overbearing man vilified her. The old man, in his rage, summoned his 5 sons and ordered the eldest to execute his own mother. The boy hemmed and hawed, but would not agree to kill his mother. The second son also refused, as did the third and the fourth. The old man then cursed the boys to be senseless like animals. Finally, he ordered Rama to kill Renuka. Rama obediently raised an axe and cut off his mother's head. After a while, Jamadagni calmed down a bit and blessed his son Rama for having been the obedient son. He asked Rama what boon would he wish for. Rama said he'd like his mother and brothers restored, and to have everyone forget that he had killed her, and that his karma not reflect the action. His father agreed and put everything back the way it was. He also blessed his son, saying he would be unrivaled at warfare, would live forever, and would have all that he desired. A few years later, on a day when all the men of the family were away, a certain king, Kartavirya, made a raid on the hermitage, stealing their calves and destroying their settlement. When Rama found out what had happened, he set out with his bow to fight the king. As soon as he saw the king in the distance, he fired iron-tipped arrows, cutting the king's arms and legs off and then killing him. Rama then returned home, his vengeance sated. It turned out that Kartavirya had a number of sons, and they were all determined to strike back at this uppity Brahmin. The king's sons once again raided the hermitage. This time, Rama was away gathering firewood, but the old man Jamadagni was home. The old man did not put up a fight, and the princes killed him on the spot. When Rama returned home, he lamented and swore to kill everyone even remotely connected to this murder. He performed the funeral and cremation rites for his father, and then armed himself for war. Parashurama then single-handedly killed the princes, their retainers, their nobles, and finally the entire race of Kshatriyas. It says elsewhere that the Kshatriyas were reformulated when the surviving Kshatriya widows copulated with Brahmins and made their sons honorary Kshatriyas. However that happened, Rama once again exterminated them all. He repeated this genocide 21 times until finally his grandfather, Ruchika, begged him to cut it out. So that's the story of Parashurama as given in the Book of the Forest. Following this, we are told that Rama Jamadagnya himself made an appearance and Yudhishthira greeted him reverentially. If anything was said between them, we don't know because the story moves quickly on to the next holy site. That's all for now. I had promised last time to go into the strange relationship Rshyashrnga has with the legend of the unicorn in Western mythology. According to our translator, J.A.B. Van Buitenen, the earliest sources of the unicorn myth come from Egypt in the 2nd century A.D. In the Physiologus, they describe the unicorn as a goat-like creature from India with a single horn growing out of its head. It is gentle, but can only be captured by a virgin. Given that in many other versions of the Rshyashrnga story, the Princess Shanta is the boy's seductress, it really sounds like the Greek writers conveying a corrupt version of the same story. Other evidence includes the other name for Rshyashrnga, which is Ekashrnga, meaning one horn. We might guess that the transformation from an ascetic into a deer is due to the other mythical beast from India, the rhinoceros, which merged along with our story by the time it made its way to the west. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata Podcast, Episode 32, Sukanya and Cyavana. Last time, we heard 2 stories, one of Rshyashrnga and the other about Rama Jamadagnya. I talked a little bit about the theory that the story of Rshyashrnga made its way to the West in the form of the legend of the unicorn. The story of Parasurama also merits some comments. First, Rama is one of the 3 fighting Brahmins in the Mahabharata, the other 2 being Kripa and Drona, the tutors to our heroes. Rama stands out among them as the one who is not only a match for the Kshatriya nobles in war, but was actually vastly more powerful. By dint of his longevity, Rama feuded with the Kshatriyas and killed them off 21 times before his Bhirgu elder finally restrained him. There is a sense of great antiquity about Rama Jamadagnya. By the time of our story, his killing days are long over, and he seems to have a ghostly quality in his visitations. Some traditions place his genocide of the Kshatriyas at the juncture of the Treta and Dvapar Yugas. The sense of decline, especially in the qualities of the Kshatriya nobles, is underscored by a speech Krishna gave when encouraging the Pandavas to kill Jarasandha. I think I quoted it back then, but here's the pertinent part. Krishna said, "Those which are called Kshatriyas today were born after the Kshatriyas were wiped out by Rama Jamadagnya. These new Kshatriyas have declared their lineages by their own authority." Krishna's meaning was that it would be no great sin to depose a king like Jarasandha, since his descent was questionable in any case. While it still seems strange that among the greatest warriors of the Mahabharata are 3 Brahmins, one point seems clear. The lineages of the Brahmins were much more ancient and reliable than those claimed by the Kshatriya caste. Getting back to our heroes, the story of their pilgrimage resumes with a long poem listing the many sacred places they visited. I did not try locating the sites, but by the end the Pandavas end up at Prabhasa Ford. Prabhasa is now known more commonly as Somnath, which is one of the great pilgrimage sites in southwest India in Gujarat province. If you've been following along, the Pandavas have been traveling eastward to the shores of Bengal, where they met Rama Jamadagnya last episode. Now, suddenly, they are on the far western end of India, at the southern tip of Gujarat. I guess their journey through the south was uneventful. If you have a sense of the geography of the Mahabharata, you should know that Somnath is in the same neighborhood as Krishna's famous citadel, Dvarka, and thus Krishna and Balram popped by for a visit. This was a very pro forma meeting, in which Balram expressed his outrage, Krishna reassured him, and Yudhishthira restated his vow to wait the full 13 years before making a move. I'll spare you the speechifying, since that's all there was to the meeting. After the speeches, they each went their separate ways. Krishna and Balram returned home to Dwarka, while the Pandavas went south, finally stopping at a ford on the Narmada River. Lomasha pointed out that once the gods had gathered here at the Narmada to partake of the Soma. This was where the Ashvins first took the Soma and became first-rate deities. Yudhishthira wanted to hear more, so Lomasha told him the story of Sukanya and Cyavana. Lomasha said, "The great seer Bhirgu had a son named Cyavana Bhargava, and this glorious man performed austerities near this lake. Rigid as a post, the splendid ascetic maintained the Vira pose and stood in the same spot for a very long time. Over the years, an ant colony moved in, and soon their anthill covered most of his body. He was overgrown with vines and covered in ants. Years later, a king named Saryati came by the lake with his harem to play. By now, the vines had become trees, and the trees were blooming. One princess, the king's daughter named Sukanya, strolled by this flowery anthill, admiring the blossoms. Cyavana watched from the midst of the brambles as Sukanya's friends walked away, leaving the comely wench alone with the anthill. The grizzled little man admired her looks and became enamored with her. He tried to speak, but his dried-up throat only made a croaking sound. The girl peeked into the brambles curiously, then grabbed a stick and poked the old man's lascivious eye. The sadhu's reaction is a bit surprising. He was angered that he'd been poked in the eye, so in revenge he made the king's guards constipated. The king soon discovered that his soldiers were unable to piss or shit, so he instantly suspected that someone had been messing with the sadhu. Saryati summoned his women and asked them who had disturbed the old Bhargava. The women all swore their innocence. The king then interrogated the women separately. Observing that the guards were uncomfortable and her father worried, Sukanya finally stepped up. She said, "When I was wandering, I saw a creature staring out of an anthill. I thought it was a frog, so I poked it with a stick." When he heard this, Saryati rushed to the anthill and bowed before the withered old ascetic. "Please forgive me for what this stupid girl did." Cyavana Bhargava replied, "If I receive in marriage this your daughter, I shall forgive you." Saryati didn't hesitate. He handed over the troublesome girl and rushed back to check the health of his soldiers. Like all the princess brides we've seen in this series of tales, Sukanya was a surprisingly compliant bride for her crude and severe husband. She served him and maintained his guests loyally. One day, after several years of this marital bliss, Sukanya was out bathing when the twin gods, the Ashvins, came by and saw her naked and beautiful in the water. They waited until she was done and then asked her who she was and what she was doing out in the woods and all alone. Sukanya replied modestly that she was Saryati's daughter and the property and wife of Cyavana. The Ashvins were astonished and laughed out loud. They asked her, "How is it that your father handed a beautiful girl like you over to that dried-up old sadhu? Why does a noble woman like you wait upon a decrepit husband who has long passed the joys of love? Why don't you cast off that old Cyavana and marry one of us?" The girl bowed before the twin gods and said, "I am devoted to my husband. Do not cast suspicion on me." I guess immortality and omnipotence combined to create strange pastimes, because the Ashvins then suggested that they could make old Cyavana as handsome as they were. Sukanya obediently checked with her husband, and Cyavana approved. The Ashvins said, "To finish this, you must jump into the water." The old sadhu gamely jogged down to the river and jumped in. The Ashvins followed on his heels, and they also jumped into the river. After some splashing, the three equally handsome young men emerged out of the river. All three men spoke to Sukanya, saying, "Choose one of us for your husband, whichever you desire." Virtuous Sukanya opened her mind's eye and chose the man who stirred her heart. Her choice was, of course, her husband, Cyavana. Cyavana was so delighted with this turn of events that he thanked the Ashvins heartily, saying, "You have endowed an old man with youth and beauty, and I may now enjoy my faithful wife. I am pleased with what you have done for me, and in return I shall brew up a pot of soma just for you guys, and you shall drink the soma in the presence of the king of the gods, Indra himself. This I swear to you." When news of his daughter's fortune reached the palace, King Saryati rushed down to the hermitage to congratulate his virile son-in-law. Still in high spirits, Cyavana told the king to prepare the ingredients and the sacrificial terrace so they may hold a soma sacrifice. On the next auspicious date, Cyavana performed the soma ritual before the king. Summoning the Ashvins, Cyavana poured a cup of soma for each to drink. Suddenly, Indra appeared and stopped the Ashvins from drinking. Indra said, "These two Nasatyas are not worthy of the soma. They are healers to the sons of the gods, and thus their occupation precludes them from this honor." Cyavana said, "You know that the Ashvins are gods just like you. Do not despise them. They have made me superior like an ageless celestial." Indra argued back, but Cyavana was done with arguing. He had already poured a second cup and was holding it out for the Ashvins. Indra shouted, "Stop, or I'll blast you with my thunderbolt." The king of gods drew back his arm to strike, but Cyavana paralyzed his arm at a glance. The priest then turned to his fire and prepared his magic for battle. Chanting long-forgotten words of power, Cyavana summoned from the depths of hell a monstrous asura named Mata. This was one of the really mean guys from when the universe was still young. He was capable of eating entire planets for breakfast. As the creature realized he had been set free in the world of men, he looked around for something to destroy, and spotted Indra there with his fighting arm already incapacitated. As the beast charged at him, Indra said to Cyavana, "The Ashvin shall deserve the soma, just help me deal with this beast." Having succeeded in extorting Indra, Cyavana lifted his spell and subdued Mata. He could not kill such a powerful creature, so he divided his power and restricted it to the vices of the world, namely liquor, women, dice, and hunting. Thus, Mata lives on, but is unable to harm the virtuous or the abstinent. The Ashvins then enjoyed their first cup of soma, while Indra presided. Indra said, "Just as today you helped the Ashvins qualify for the soma, so did I set all this up, so your power could shine forth, and the fame of Sukanya and her father will spread throughout the whole world." That ends the story of Sukanya and Cyavana. The narrative moves on almost immediately to another story about Mandatar. Lomasha simply announces that they have now reached the banks of the Yamuna River, where the mighty king Mandatar once worshipped. This story is so brief as to count as just an anecdote. It begins with his father, Yuvanashva, a mighty king who had performed 1,000 horse sacrifices. Despite it all, he had no sons. Since they didn't have fertility clinics, the king did the next best thing. He went to a Bhrigu hermitage to practice yoga until he had a son. Yuvanashva worked out relentlessly, while the Bhargava priests worked on a solution. One evening, while all the hermits were sleeping, the king called out from one of his yoga poses for water. He was so parched from lack of food and sleep that no one could hear his voice. Finally, Yuvanashva untangled himself and went in search of water for himself. Looking around one of the huts, he found a pot of water on the shelf and drank from it, then poured the rest on the ground. He then drifted off in a blissful sleep. The next morning, King Yuvanashva awoke to a big commotion. The Brahmins were running around looking for the pot of water. The king told them he had drunk some and tossed out the rest. The priest said, "Don't you know that we have been preparing this water for months to give to your wives so they will bear you sons? Since fate is everything and the spell cannot be undone, you shall yourself give birth to a son." After 100 years had passed, the king's side split open and out popped a baby boy. The king miraculously survived the explosion. Indra, whom they call Chakra in this story, appeared and offered his finger to the baby to suckle. Thus, rather than having a mother, the boy was nursed by the god Indra and was named Mandatar. It says Mandatar grew to be a giant in size, and when he became king, he conquered the 4 directions. That's about all they have to say about Mandatar. If you've been following all these stories since the Pandavas began their tour of the fords, you might have noticed that, with the exception of Nala, the hero of each tale has always been a Brahmin, and usually the Brahmin hero had an obedient Kshatriya wife. This has been the pattern of each story until this one about Mandatar. Still, the Brahmins demonstrated that they could even replace a woman's role in childbearing if needed. There's still more stories to come, so I'll put off any attempt to make generalizations about them until the end. Just suffice it to say that so far, Mandatar and Nala are the only stories that have a Kshatriya as a protagonist. That's all for now. There are a few more stories to go, but soon we'll be back to the main story as the Pandavas go looking for their brother. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata podcast, episode 33, The Hawk and the Dove. Last time, the Pandavas continued their pilgrimage, traveling from the Narmada River north to the Yamuna. The traveling was uneventful, but we heard the stories of Sukanya and Mandatar. Many of Lomasha's stories so far have involved a Brahmin hero with a compliant and loyal wife. Nala was the exception in that the main character was a king, but he too had a very loyal and forbearing Kshatriya wife. Thus Mandatar represents a break in the pattern, in that he had no mother, nor is there any mention of a wife. Most of Lomasha's stories seem to serve a propagandistic purpose, since most of the heroes are Brahmins. And in this last story, it is the Brahmins who are able to stand in for the mother's role in childbearing. This concern with fertility in kings continues on in the next story, called Jantu. By this point, the Pandavas had reached Kurukshetra. They had nearly made a full circuit of India, and, out of the blue, Yudhishthira asked Lomasha about the life and deeds of the ancient king Samaka. Lomasha told them, "There once was a virtuous king named Samaka, who had 100 wives of the same rank. In spite of great efforts, he failed to beget a son on them. Eventually, after he had grown old and spent for trying, one of his wives finally conceived and bore a son named Jantu. This kid was coddled and spoiled by his 100 mothers, as the whole palace worried about his health. He was also a very weak and sickly child, so the king constantly worried that he might outlive his heir. Matters came to a head one day when the brat Jantu was out playing, and he was bitten on the arse by an ant. The boy shrieked loudly in pain, while all the women gathered around him and wrung their hands in concern. King Samaka had witnessed the whole scene and got fed up. He summoned his learned priests and complained, "Having just one son is worse than having none. I personally inspected and selected these 100 women, and after so much trouble, they only produced this sickly specimen. And now, all our lives depend on this brat. Don't you have some spell or something that could get me 100 sons?" One priest had just the magic for the occasion. He suggested that if they sacrificed Jantu and had the women inhale the smoke from his funeral pyre, they would each conceive a son. Not to worry about young Jantu either, because he will transmigrate and will be one of the 100 sons, reborn to the same mother. King Samaka readily agreed to this deal and ordered the Brahmin to fire up the ritual. After preparing the fire, the priest walked over to the nursery, grabbed the child Jantu, and led him towards the sacred fire. The women had not been informed of the king's decision, but they grew suspicious and ran after the boy, crying and wailing as they went. The women tried to snatch the boy back, but it was too late. The priest struck the boy on the head and threw him into the fire. The women all fell to the ground in anguish, and then breathed in the smoke from the fire. All 100 wives fell unconscious, and each conceived a son. After 10 months, Samaka's wives bore 100 sons. The first to give birth was Jantu's mother, and he was also named Jantu. Endowed with a healthier body, this new and improved Jantu became heir to the throne. In time, the priest died, and later King Samaka died as well. Samaka ascended into heaven, but noticed his helpful priest was trapped in the fires of hell. Samaka went to him and asked why he was being punished. The Brahmin replied, "You see me burning here because I sacrificed your son." Samaka declared, "I shall enter the fire in place of this priest, since he was acting on my orders." At this point, Dharma broke in on the conversation and said, "No one suffers the sins of another." Samaka challenged Dharma, saying, "Then I shall join with him in this suffering, for I do not crave heaven as long as this priest remains here." Dharma is not one to bend the rules, so he said, "Very well, join your friend. You can both come out when his term is done." Lomasha concluded his story. The king served out his turn in the netherworld, and then he and his priest both rose up to the blessed realms. At this point, the whole plot device of having the Pandavas on tour wears a bit thin. Lomasha starts calling out place names as if he were a tour guide on a high-speed train. He points out the Sarasvati River, then Kurukshetra, then the ford of the Sindhu, then the lake of Kashmir, then to the rivers Jala and Upajala near the Yamuna, where Ushanara excelled over Indra. Of course, Yudhishthira had to hear all about that, so begins the next story called The Hawk and the Dove. Not much background is given in this story. It just starts with Indra and Agni deciding to test King Ushanara to see if he is as great as everyone says. So Indra turned himself into a hawk, while Agni transformed into a dove. In hot pursuit, the dove flew onto the king's lap. Granting it shelter, the king nestled the dove and waved off the hawk. The hawk was annoyed and complained to the king, "Sire, you know the law better than anyone, so why do you deny me?" The king replied, "This frightened bird came to me seeking shelter. He was defenseless and asked for my protection. How could a king fail to protect the weak? That would be contrary to my dharma." The hawk said, "My lord, it is by food that all creatures are able to exist. If you deprive me of food for even a short time, I will die. And if I die, my wife and children will surely follow after me. So, by protecting this dove, you will destroy many lives." The king was impressed at the hawk's subtle knowledge of dharma. He said, "Best of birds, your speech is so beautiful, you are certainly versed in the law. So tell me, do you think it would be right for me to abandon a refugee? All you need is some food, so I can have a deer or a boar cooked up for you." The hawk said, "Boar and deer meat are not my kind of food. Doves are my sustenance, so let that one go, so I may eat my lawful food." This the king would not do. He said, "I can give you anything you want, but just not this dove. Tell me what I should do, because I shall not give this up." The hawk said, "Ushanara, if you love this dove so much, then I shall take a piece of your flesh, equal in weight to the dove." The king was a bit overweight, so he figured he could spare a dove's weight in fat. So the king pulled out a sharp knife and ordered up a scale. The dove was placed on one side, while Ushanara removed slices of flesh and placed them on the opposite side of the balance. Soon he'd removed his beer belly and spare tire, but still the dove weighed more than the gobs of fat. Ushanara continued slicing off flesh and placing it on the scales until he was a bloody mess, but still the dove weighed more. Finally, the bloody, pulped king dragged himself bodily onto the scale. At last the hawk let him in on the joke. He praised the king, saying, "I am Indra and this dove is the god Agni. We came here to test your commitment to Dharma. This shall be your shining glory for all time." I don't know if Ushanara had a good laugh over this and then died of massive blood loss, or whether the gods did him the favor of putting him back together, because the story ends right there. Lomasha then resumes calling out new place names, but this time I get the sense that they're moving northwards into the Himalayas. He mentions the Kanakala Mountains, the river Ganga, Bhirgu's Peak, and a lake called Punya. Lomasha then pointed out the lovely hermitage of Raibhya, where the sage Yavakrita Bharavaja found his death. If you haven't noticed by now, sages rarely die in the Mahabharata, so this must be an interesting story. Of course, Yudhishthira wanted to hear all about it. This story of Raibhya and Yavakrita is vague on the one point that makes it interesting. That is, apparently, one of the two ascetic friends is a Brahmin, while the other is from a lower caste, presumably a Vaishya. The story begins with the friends Bharadvaja and Raibhya. It says Raibhya and his two sons were versed in the Vedas, while Bharadvaja was merely an ascetic, yet the two were the best of friends. Our translator Vambutanen takes this to mean that Raibhya was a Brahmin, while Bharadvaja was merely a non-Brahmin ascetic. From other stories, it would be safe to assume that Bharadvaja was not a Kshatriya, because they would have told us so. The Brahmin Raibhya had two sons, while Bharadvaja had one named Yavakri. Yavakri noticed how his father did not get the same respect as Raibhya and his sons did, and Yavakri resented this. As he grew older, the boy decided he would outdo the Brahmins in austerities, and thereby would gain the knowledge of the Vedas by brute force. Despite warnings from his father, the determined boy began doing such severe austerities that it set alarm bells off in heaven. Indra came down to see what the boy was up to, and asked him what he was after. Yavakri told Indra that he was interested in nothing less than mastery of the Vedas. Indra told the boy, "Don't waste your time trying to gain Vedic knowledge through suffering. It is much easier to just find a teacher and learn it the old-fashioned way." The boy was stubborn, however, and he threatened to burn his limbs in the sacrificial fire if he did not get what he wanted. Indra finally relented and granted knowledge of the Vedas to both Yavakri and his father Bharadvaja. Yavakri returned happily to his father's camp and told him the good news. The old man was one of those Vaishyas who knew their place, and he warned his son about getting too uppity. Bharadvaja warned his son that even with his achievements he should not grow too proud. If he should offend the Brahmins, there would surely be trouble. Yavakri was unconcerned. After all, he had all the best magic, so no one could mess with him. Thus, despite the warnings, Yavakri put on airs and treated other ascetics rudely. Fearlessly, Yavakri wandered where he pleased and did what he pleased. One day, he happened upon Rahibya's encampment. At the time, no one was home except Rahibya's daughter-in-law. Yavakri thought up a good way to snub the proud Brahmins. He propositioned their woman. He brazenly walked up to Rahibya's daughter-in-law and said, "Make love to me." When the girl refused, he raped her. Later, when Rahibya and his sons returned home, she told them what had happened. Rahibya became furious and pulled a strand of hair from his head and offered it to the fire. Using this magic, he summoned two beings from the fire. The first was a lovely woman, while the second was a monstrous Rakshasa. Rahibya directed them to go off and kill Yavakri. The supernatural pair hunted down Yavakri. The vixen approached him lustfully, and while seducing him, she grabbed his water bowl and ran off. Robbed of his magic bowl, Yavakri became instantly unpure. The Rakshasa then rushed at him murderously. As long as Yavakri was unclean, he was magically defenseless, so he ran to the nearby pond to wash, but the pond was dry. He ran to the river, but it was dried up too. Desperately, he ran to his father's fire pit, but his way was blocked by his father's Shudra guard. While the guard held him back, Yavakri was impaled by the Rakshasa's spear. When Bharadvaja returned home, he came across the dead body of his son. After his guard told him what happened, he worked out that the boy must have offended Rahibya and had been punished. Bharadvaja mourned his only son and resolved to follow him to the next world. As he prepared his son's funeral pyre, he cursed Rahibya to die at the hands of his eldest son. Then Bharadvaja cremated his son and then entered the fire himself. Around this same time, Rahibya's sons, Paravasu and Arvavasu, had gotten a job with the king performing a major sacrifice. The eldest, Paravasu, returned home to bring the news. That evening, Rahibya was wrapped in an antelope skin wandering around the camp. As Paravasu approached the camp, he saw the old man and thought he was a Sasquatch and killed him on the spot. Since it was done in self-defense, Paravasu apparently took it pretty well. All we're told is that he performed his funerary duties, cremated the old man, then returned to his brother. Paravasu told his brother that he would need to perform the king's rite by himself because he needed Arvavasu to perform the spell that expiates the sin of killing a Brahmin. But since Arvavasu had performed it, he incurred the sin of his brother and was expelled as a Brahmin killer. Agni took pity on Arvavasu and expiated his sins, wiping them clean. He also granted Arvavasu a wish. The boy asked that all the protagonists be made whole and put right, so everyone was restored to the way they were and they lived happily ever after. For those of you who have been wondering when we would get past all these stories and back to the main plot, I have good news. Because after this, the heroes set out for Mount Kailash, deep in the Himalayas, where they will finally have some adventures of their own. I'll tell you all about it next time. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata Podcast, episode 34, Monkey's Uncle. Last episode was the final one in a series of side stories that were worked into the Book of the Forest as part of the Pandavas' travels through the holy sites of India. Their tour guide, Lomasha, narrates most of them, and the stories seem to revolve around the themes of marital loyalty and Brahmanic power. There's certainly many more of these diversionary tales to come later in the book, but we may well have just worked our way through the longest unbroken series of these stories in the entire Mahabharata. For a while at least, the Pandavas now return to center stage as the main protagonists. They have been traveling steadily northward, working their way as close as they can to Indraloka, where they hope to meet up with their prodigal brother Arjun, who remains in heaven relaxing with his father Indra. Lomasha announced to the brothers, "We have now passed beyond the mountains Mainaka and Kala. Next, we shall enter the Sveta range, where the Yakshas live with their Yaksha king Kubera. The passes are guarded by sorcerers, and the valleys are infested with Rakshasas. Beyond that lies Mount Kailash. Concerned about the dangers and hard travel ahead, Yudhishthira ordered Bhima, Sahadev, Draupadi, and all their Brahmin hangers-on to remain there at the headwaters of the Ganga, while he, Lomasha, and Nakul would press on to their tryst with Arjun. Neither Bhima nor Draupadi wanted to stay behind, so Bhima objected for both of them. None of them wanted to miss the reunion with Arjun for even a minute, and Bhima offered to carry them all if need be. Yudhishthira gave in, and soon the whole entourage pressed on to a valley inhabited by the Kunindas. Their chief, Subahu, welcomed the group and gave them the best hospitality. There, we are told, the party's servants, overseers, cooks, and Draupadi's entourage were all left behind, while Yudhishthira, his wife and brothers, and Lomasha continued on toward Mount Gandhamadana. This next pass must have been particularly high, because the travelers were hit by a freak storm that forced them all to run for cover from the rain, lightning, and hail that fell relentlessly as if the sky had fallen. The next day, the weather cleared up, and the group continued on down into the valley. As they went, Draupadi suddenly collapsed. She had finally been worn down by all the rough living, and she could go no further. Her husbands all crowded around her anxiously, while Yudhishthira bemoaned all the events and decisions that had brought this innocent princess to such a bad end. Yudhishthira said, "There's still many mountains to climb, all cragged and covered in snow. How will Krishna be able to travel through them?" This time it was Bhima's turn to comfort his elder brother. He said, "Do not despair, my king. Let's call up my son, Ghatotkacha, who can fly us all out of here." No one asked why he didn't think of this earlier. Yudhishthira just agreed to the plan, and Bhima's half-Rakshasa son appeared within moments. The strong-armed boy bowed and greeted his elders, and then offered his services to his father. Ghatotkacha had brought along a band of Rakshasas, so they each picked up a Pandava and flew up into the air. Lomasha did not need this help, because he could fly any time he wanted to. The group now made rapid progress, flying over a vast wilderness and hordes of barbarians. They flew right over the heads of the northern Kurus, and finally they reached the foothills of Mount Kailash. As they descended for landing, the ancient hermitage of Nar came into view, with its tame animals and fruit trees that always bore fruit. When our heroes' feet touched that hallowed ground, they felt all their pains and weariness fall away. The Pandavas settled down contentedly in this paradise, daily making offerings to their ancestors and frolicking in the gardens with Draupadi. Both their spirits and their bodies were refreshed in this holy place. They spent 6 days in this heaven-like setting, enjoying the great beauty of the lakes and flowers, until one day a breeze blew in from the north, carrying a single celestial lotus blossom with 1,000 petals. Draupadi ran after it and picked it up from the ground. She showed it to Bhima and said, "Look at this magical blossom. I will take this one to King Dharma, and if you love me, you'll find where this came from and bring me back an armful." Poor Bhima hadn't been sent on a real mission in years, so he was eager to begin this quest. Like a mad elephant, he rushed up the flanks of Mount Gandhamadana in search of the celestial lotus. Bhima was already on the far side of the mountain before it occurred to him that with both he and Arjun away on a mission, Draupadi no longer had a serious protector. Hoping that Yudhishthira would sensibly keep the family safe while he was away, Bhima increased his pace and hoped for the best. Bhima plowed across the gold and gem-encrusted slopes in search of the blossoms, scaring herds of elephants, rousing flocks of birds, and knocking down trees. As he rounded one mountain ridge, Bhima encountered an aging, man-sized monkey lying right in his path. He immediately sensed something unusual about this creature, so he stopped to encourage the beast to get up and out of his way. Despite all of Bhima's bluster, the monkey only yawned and stretched. Bhima bellowed for him to wake up and get out of the way until the leaves were blown off the trees and the mountains shook, but still the monkey was imperturbed. The beast smiled and asked, "Why did you wake me up when you could see that I'm not well? I'm a simple beast, but you were born of a woman, so you should know Dharma and not disturb the old and sick. What are you doing here anyway? You cannot go any further, because these lands are only accessible to ascetics." Bhima was getting increasingly suspicious of this well-spoken animal. He asked, "Who are you? Why are you disguised as a monkey? Whatever you are, be aware that I am a Kshatriya, son of Kunti, of the lunar dynasty, and I am addressing you, so tell me who you are." The creature simply replied, "I'm just a monkey, and I will not get out of the way. You might as well turn back or meet your perdition." Now Bhima was getting annoyed. He said, "I'm not asking for your perdition or anything else, monkey, so just make way, lest you meet your perdition." The monkey sighed, "I lack the strength to get up. I'm old and sick. If you really must get by, then jump over me." Bhima said, "I could easily leap over you and this mountain, just like Hanuman leaped over the ocean. But I sense the supreme Atman is strong in you, and I shall not defile the Atman in that way." The monkey asked, "Who is this Hanuman fellow?" Bhima said, "He's my brother, endowed with reason, courage, and strength. For the sake of Rama's wife, this Indra of the apes jumped the ocean in a single leap. That great hero is my brother, and I equal him in strength and skill. So just move along so no one gets hurt." The monkey sighed again, less convincingly, and said, "Have mercy, I'm too old to get up. Just pick up my tail and walk past." Bhima contemptuously reached down to brush away the tail, but he found it unyielding. Stooping down with a grunt, Bhima locked both hands around the tail and pulled with all his strength, but still he could not move it even 1 inch. Finally, realizing he'd been beat, Bhima gave up and prostrated himself before this remarkable creature. He said, "Forgive my insult. Whether you are Siddha or God, Gandharva or Guyaka, please tell me why you pretend to be a monkey." The monkey's answer amounted to a summary of the Ramayana. He said, "I was born the son of the wind god. I am the monkey known as Hanuman. In the days of my youth, that great hero Rama Dasarati walked the earth. When his wife Sita was abducted by Ravana, I helped him by jumping over the ocean to find her at Ravana's palace. As a reward for my service, Lord Rama granted that I would live as long as the tale of the Ramayana is remembered. For 11,000 years, King Rama ruled his kingdom, and then he went to heaven. These days, I rest and listen to the Apsaras and Gandharvas sing about Rama's deeds." Hanuman continued, "As for this road, it cannot be traveled by mortals. I am stopping you for your own good. Besides, the pond you seek is close nearby." Bhima nearly forgot about his mission in his delight on meeting his famous brother. He said, "This is like the best thing that's ever happened to me. If you would please do me one favor, I would like to see you as you were back in the days when you fought for King Rama." Hanuman laughed sadly and said, "Those days are long past, and nothing is as it once was. Nowadays, all things are dingy and diminished, and we cannot go back to the way we were in those halcyon days." Bhima, having picked up the habit from his brother, scented a story and asked the monkey to tell him all about the 4 yugas and how things have changed since Lord Rama walked the earth. Hanuman replied with a reasonably succinct lecture on the 4 yugas. The yugas can be seen as 4 points on a wheel, which turn slowly from one epoch to the next, spelling out a long decline from a golden age until it reaches a complete nadir during the current age called the Kali Yuga. The first of these epochs, called the Krita Yuga, is the Golden Age. At that time, Dharma is in full force. Creatures do not die, there is no commerce, nor is there human labor. One can obtain food by mere thought. There is no old age, no disease, no fear, no hatred, no suffering, no envy, no jealousy. The castes are all well defined, and everyone stays in their place. There are no gods placed above us, nor are there demonic creatures beneath us. The next age is called the Treta Yuga. At this time, Dharma is diminished by 1/4. Each person lives by their own rule, but now sacrifices and rituals are required to maintain equilibrium. The third age is called the Dvapar Yuga, and in this era, Dharma is at half power. In this age, the 4 Vedas are revealed. The path to truth becomes divided and confused. Many people practice corrupt versions of the sacrifices, while others are driven by their passions. Those seeking salvation must either perform brutal austerities, or they must sponsor elaborate sacrifices. In the Dvapar Yuga, creatures' lives are cut short because they lack virtue. Finally, the 4th age is called the Kali Yuga, and it is the era of discord. Dharma is running at quarter power. By the end, the Vedas are forgotten. Dharma, sacrifice, and ritual all come to an end. Crop failure, disease, and vice prevail. Without Dharma, the people degenerate. Hanuman concluded his dissertation saying, "Thus is described the Kali Yuga that will be shortly at hand. As for wanting to see me in giant mode, what is the point of that? You know who I am, and you know my history. What more do you want?" Bhima was determined, however, to see the giant monkey, so he pressed on petulantly. He said, "I'm not leaving until you show me your giant form." Because it was his brother, after all, who was making the request, Hanuman complied. He stood up and began growing larger and larger, until he was larger than the mountain peaks that surrounded them. Finally, the monkey stopped growing any bigger. He said, "This should be big enough for you. I can grow even larger if I am attacked, but you would not be able to bear it if I got any bigger." Bhima was more than satisfied with this demonstration. He clapped his hands with delight and said, "Contract yourself, please. I can more easily stare at the morning sun than look at you like this. But now I'm surprised that Rama had to even lift a finger to kill Ravana, when you could have easily managed the whole affair by yourself. The monkey quickly assumed his former stature and answered Bhima, saying, "You are quite right. Ravana and his cronies were no match for me. But if I had done the whole job, then Lord Rama would never have shown the world his own great deeds." Having grown tired from his exertions, Hanuman dismissed Bhima, telling him the way to find the Saugandika forest, where he would find the magic lotus blossoms he was seeking. The monkey said, "This path will lead you to the garden of Kubera, but be careful, it is guarded by yakshas and rakshasas, so don't just go plucking flowers without permission." The brothers then embraced tearfully. Impulsively, Hanuman offered Bhima a wish. He said, "Choose a boon, brother. If you'd like, I could fly to Hastinapur and bury all your enemies. If you'd like me to smash up the whole city, just say the word." Bhima said, "All that I ask for is your forgiveness for my rudeness. As long as we have your support, we shall surely be victorious." Hanuman then offered to do this. "When the great battle commences, Arjun shall fly a pennant, and when you raise your battle cry, I shall perch on that flagstaff and will lend my voice to yours. I shall utter fearful roars that will rob your enemies of their lives." Hanuman then vanished, and Bhima resumed his course towards Saugandika forest. Now, sure of his course, Bhima crossed a mountain ridge and saw a beautiful valley with a magical river meandering peacefully at the bottom. In a bend in the river, he spotted a pond, filled with the divine lotus flowers that he was seeking. Bhima had discovered Kubera's secret pleasure garden. As he drew nearer to the Saugandika forest, he encountered a line of thousands of rakshasas who were guarding the park. Confused at the sight of this bold human, dressed like a sadhu but wearing a sword, the ogres challenged Bhima, telling him to go back where he came from. Bhima ignored the creatures and pressed on with his mission, jumping into the pond and greedily plucking the precious lotus flowers. The ogres needed no further prompting. They pressed in from all sides and attacked Bhima there in the pond. In short order, Bhima was surrounded by a growing heap of Rakshasa corpses. The more intelligent ones then realized that they had a problem, while the stupid ones had trouble climbing over the mountain of bodies that lay between them and their enemy. The ogres needed no further prompting. They pushed in from all sides and attacked Bhima right there in the pond. In short order, Bhima was surrounded by a growing heap of Rakshasa corpses. The more intelligent ones realized that they had a problem, while the stupid ones had trouble climbing over the mountain of bodies that lay between them and their enemy. The Rakshasas then called for a general retreat while they reported the news to their boss, Kubera. Bhima took advantage of this respite to drink the healing waters and gather more flowers for his beloved. News of the break-in quickly reached Kubera at his court. When he discovered that the perpetrator was the famous Bhimasena Kanteya, he laughed and told the Rakshasas, "Let Bhima take all the flowers he wants. He's doing this for his wife, and I am fully aware of his purpose." Meanwhile, back at the camp, Yudhishthira had been hearing deep rumbles coming from the far hillsides, but he thought it was just a nearby thunderstorm. As the day went by, the signs grew more ominous. The sky grew ruddy, and an enormous dust cloud sprang up from the distant mountainside. The foreboding signs of war made Yudhishthira suspicious. He went out looking for Bhima. The Dharmaraja did not find his brother, but he did come across Draupadi. He asked after her husband, and she told him all about his mission for the lotus flowers. Without missing a beat, Yudhishthira summoned his nephew Gatotkacha and had him fly them all out to Saugandika Pond in search of Bhima. By the time they got there, the battle was over. The pond was surrounded by heaps of corpses, while Bhima swam happily, gathering lotus flowers in his arms. Yudhishthira asked him, "What have you done? It isn't safe to offend gods like this. Please do me a favor and don't do anything like this again." The brothers embraced, and then all of them entered the pond to wash and revitalize in its divine waters. Not long after, a contingent of Kubera's guards presented themselves. Surprisingly, there was no hard feelings, and the Yakshas humbly informed the Pandavas that they were welcome to stay on as Kubera's guests. Thus, for the next few days, the Pandavas and Lomasha stayed there in the magical pleasure garden of the god of riches and wealth. That's all for now, but stay tuned for next time, because Arjun is back. His next adventure is oddly similar to Krishna's UFO battle against King Shalva, but I'll tell you all about it next time. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata Podcast, episode 35. Welcome back, Arjun. Last time, the Pandavas traveled about as far north as could be imagined, to the slopes of Mount Kailash, where they camped out at the hermitage of Nar Narayan. Hijinks ensued when a 1,000-petal lotus blew off the mountain, and Draupadi sent Bhima off in search of the source of these divine flowers. Bhima devastates the slopes of the mountain in search of the lotus, and along the way he encounters Hanuman. At this point, the famous monkey is incredibly ancient, and he gives us a brief first-hand account of the Ramayana. It turns out that Bhima and Hanuman are brothers because they are both sons of the wind god. The monkey tells Bhima where to find the flowers and then vanishes. The source of the flowers is a pond in the middle of the god Kubera's pleasure garden. Kubera's garden is guarded by hordes of Rakshasas, but by now Rakshasas are not a big problem for Bhima. In no time, he slaughtered a vast army of the creatures and then dove into the pond, drinking in the healing waters and gathering lotus flowers. Inexplicably, Kubera doesn't get angry over the vandalism and death. He welcomes Bhima and allows the rest of the Pandavas to stay in his garden. Among the gods, Kubera is kind of an odd duck. He's the god of wealth, but he's also the king of the Yakshas. Van Buitenen characterizes Yakshas as genial leprechauns, hardly a fearful race. Unlike other gods, Kubera also seems to rule over a real geographic location. Remember when the Asura Maya built Yudhishthira's palace? Maya traveled north to Kubera to retrieve gems and gold for the new structure. Now what happens next is a little confusing. The story seems to jump back in time and retells what happened after the Pandavas were dropped off at Nar Narayan's hermitage. In this version, not all the Brahmin hangers-on were left behind with Kuninda. Some were carried along by Ghatotkacha's flying Rakshasas and stayed with the Pandavas at the hermitage. Among these Brahmins was one bad Rakshasa in disguise. This guy was interested in stealing their weapons and armor. His name was Jatasura. When Bhima went out hunting, Jatasura broke out of his disguise and grabbed their weapons, grabbed Draupadi, Yudhishthira, and Nakul, and flew off with them. Sahadev managed to break free, and he ran off to get Bhima. Yudhishthira was not greatly disturbed. He had been through too much to be bothered by a single rogue Rakshasa. He just scolded the beast as it carried them away. Yudhishthira said to the ogre, "Your prospects don't look good at the moment. We protected you, fed you, and honored you, and now you've done this. Such serious breaches of dharma are swiftly punished. If you'd like any chance of surviving, then put us down and give us our weapons and let us fight fairly." Yudhishthira then began to grow heavy. He grew so heavy that the ogre had to struggle to move at all. The king said, "Have no fear, fool Rakshasas. I've slowed his pace, and Bhima will be here soon enough." By the time Bhima got to them, he had worked himself into a fury. He told Jatasur, "I knew you were a Rakshasa a long time ago, but I didn't care. You did your duties and didn't bother us, so we let you live. But now you've crossed the line." Jatasur then released his captives and charged angrily at his ogre-slaying foe. An abbreviated fight scene ensued, with trees knocked down and a boulder fight, but it ended predictably with the dead Rakshasa and a victorious Bhima. There's a sense of jumping back in time again. This time, Yudhishthira announces that Arjun's 5-year mission to acquire WMD is nearly over, and they must head north to meet him. Again, they are flown northward with Ghatotkacha to Mount Gandhamadana to stay at an ancient ashram. This time, however, the ashram is named after Rshyashrnga. While they stayed at this earthly paradise, a fabulous 5-colored flower blew in on the breeze. Draupadi spotted the flower and sent Bhima off to find more. This time, Bhima invaded Kubera's kingdom, and he was immediately engaged in a war with all the Yakshas, Rakshasas, and Gandharvas that lived there. Bhima killed vast numbers of them and sent the remainder running in fear. Only the Rakshasa leader, Manamat, continued to fight. This Rakshasa general put up a good fight, but Bhima in the end killed him as well. Once again, Yudhishthira heard the commotion on the mountaintop and quickly headed up there to see what Bhima was up to. When they got there, Bhima had already killed or scattered all the enemies, and Yudhishthira begged him not to do it again. While this reunion was taking place, Kubera rode up in his chariot with a large force of fairy tale creatures behind him. The Pandavas prepared to fight until they saw Kubera was laughing and smiling. He told them everything was fine. Bhima had just been fulfilling a curse made long ago. It turns out that many years before, Kubera had gone to a convention of the gods with his buddy Manamat. Manamat sort of crashed the party and spat on Agastya while he was performing a sacrifice. The irritable old sage cursed Manamat to die, along with his minions, at the hands of a human, and that Kubera should also suffer for it. So Bhima had done them all a favor, and Kubera was happy with the outcome. This time, Kubera did not invite them to stay. He sent them back to Arshdasena's ashram with some gifts. Finally, after all these diversions, the 5th year of Arjun's mission came to an end, and the Pandavas waited expectantly for their brother to return. Not long afterward, they spotted a celestial chariot descending from the sky. It was Indra's chariot, driven by Matali, with Arjun, diademed and garlanded, riding shotgun. Piled in the back were heaps of magical weapons. Vyasa switches to poetry at this point to cover the joyful reunion of the 5 brothers. Arjun dismounted the chariot, showed them all the cool stuff he picked up from the gods, and then told them all about his adventures in heaven. Most of Arjun's story was a retelling of his journey to heaven, how he fought Shiva, learned to use various weapons, and then studied dance with Chitrasena. Arjun then went on to say that, after he had mastered all the divine weapons, his father Indra then demanded his guru fee. Arjun readily agreed to whatever he desired. Indra said, "With your training and weapons, nothing in the three worlds is impossible to you. I have enemies, a bunch of Danavas, who are called Nivatakavakas. They live in an inaccessible spot by the sea. There are 30 million of them, and they all look the same. Kill them all, and that shall be my fee." Indra then presented Arjun with armor matching his own, a bowstring that would never wear out, and allowed him the use of his own chariot and driver. These Nivatakavakas are variously called Asuras, Danavas, and Daityas, but their name translates roughly as clad in airtight armor. Considering that their city hovers out over the open sea, they sound vaguely like ETs in spacesuits living in a giant Vimana or UFO. The ensuing battle is very similar to Krishna's battle with King Shalva and his flying city. Whatever these creatures were, they provided Arjun an excellent opportunity to try out his cool new weapons. The Danavas used magical weapons and sorcery of various sorts to confound Arjun, but our hero had weapons and spells to counter each of them. He even launched Indra's own thunderbolts at them, killing thousands at a blast. Just as Shalva was able, briefly, to confuse Krishna into thinking Dwarka had been destroyed, these Asuras used confounding magic to distract their attackers. Arjun was blinded, and Matali was driven to despair. Arjun had a spell for this too, however, and he was able to reverse the effect, throwing his enemies into confusion and enabling him to finish them all off. When the battle was over and the UFO sunk, Matali explained to Arjun that these creatures had wrung a special deal from the grandfather of the gods, that they could live independently of the gods in their own city. Thus the gods were unable to impose their domination on these beings. For that, they had to be exterminated by a human. Arjun's brothers must have been delighted with this story. When it was over, they all crowded around Arjun's heap of weapons, and Yudhishthira asked Arjun for a demonstration. Arjun took them out one by one, showing how to turn them on, what they did, and how to fire them off. The brothers begged for a real test fire, so Arjun pulled out his Brahma missile, flipped the on switch, pointed it at a nearby mountain, and took aim. While this was going on, the sky grew dark, and a deep rumbling sounded from the roots of the earth. All the fires went out, and Brahmins everywhere forgot the Vedas. The entire universe was bracing itself for destruction. Swiftly, Indra came racing out of heaven, and he scolded Arjun for playing with loose nukes. Meekly, Arjun put his toys away, while Indra scolded Yudhishthira, saying, "These weapons are only to be used against supernatural beings. You'll get to see them soon enough." We'll leave off the story at this point, because the reunited Pandavas stay there at Kubera's garden for another 4 years. The recycling of storylines gets hard to follow at times. First, we seem to get 2 back-to-back versions of the journey north, plus the UFO battle is nearly identical to Krishna's battle with Shalva. Finally, the plot device of having a mysterious flower waft down from the Himalayas is something we have seen 3 times now. The first time we saw this was way back when the Pandavas proposed joint marriage with Draupadi. Old King Drupad was opposed to this act of polygyny, while Vyasa showed up and told him the story of the 5 Indras. In that story, the flower was spotted floating down a stream, and Indra followed it to the source, where he got into a fight with Shiva in disguise as a boy. The boy then threw Indra into a prison with 4 other Indras, and predicted they would all incarnate as the 5 Pandavas. There are subtle threads running through all of these tales, but we may never know how they originally related to each other. Next time, we'll cover the Pandavas' trip southward as they spend their remaining 2 years of exile and prepare for the 13th year in hiding. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata Podcast, episode 36, Bhima and the Snake. Last time, we covered the adventures of the Pandavas before they met up with Arjun, and then Arjun arrived, and then Arjun told us about his battle with the Asuras in spacesuits. Aside from the minor incident with Jatasura, the rest of the stories seem to be a strange remix of stories we have heard before. It is pretty hard to believe that Bhima went off in search of flowers 2 times in a row, and both times managed to make a mess out of Kubera's gardens. My guess is that we're actually seeing 2 versions of the same story, but both were too good to choose just one or the other. In the first adventure, Bhima got to meet Hanuman and hear about the Ramayana and the Yugas. The second version, which we covered last episode, generally made more sense than the first, and it ends with Arjun's return. I suspect that they were both too good to leave out, so they're just placed next to each other in the book. Way back in the early episodes, I talked a little about the physical nature of ancient Indian bookbinding. They were typically handwritten on leaves, which were bound together with a single loop of string. That might explain the linguistic relationship between the Latin word suture and the Sanskrit word sutra. A book as enormous as the Mahabharata must have been very difficult to maintain in a library. There would have been about 100 volumes, and each volume was held together by a single thread. It is easy to imagine at some point an ancient librarian found a volume missing, or pages disintegrated, or eaten by a goat. Perhaps this enterprising librarian, not wanting to take the heat for losing a piece of the ancient manuscript, recomposed the story from memory, with embellishments. In my imagination, I picture some later archivist copying a new edition and working off of two older versions, one having one version of Bhima's quest, while the other had the made-up version. I picture this guy reading both versions and having to decide which one to use in his new copy. In this case, he decided it was better to hold on to both versions. It is likely that this is one reason for the enormous size of the epic. No one had the heart to leave anything out. As for the reasons why these stories are related to the tale of the five Indras, or why Arjun's battle with the Nivatakavakas is so similar to Krishna's battle with Shalva, I doubt we'll ever know. Of course, buried there among all these recycled stories is the important news that Arjun is finally back and reunited with his brothers. As I mentioned last time, following this reunion, the Pandavas remained up in the mountains another 4 years, thus rounding out their 10th year in exile. Even though their campground was on the outskirts of paradise, Bhima had spent those years staring at Arjun's pile of weapons and dreaming of revenge. After the 10th year had passed, Bhima became too restless to stay any longer. Yudhishthira figured it would be a good time to start working on their hiding place for the 13th year, so he and the rest began making the long trek south back to India. The party retraced their steps, flying with Gatotkacha at times. They made their way back to King Subahu, who had cared for their cooks and servants while they journeyed north. The enlarged party then continued onward until they reached the slopes of Mount Yamuna. Still with plenty of time to kill, they settled down here for a while. Bhima used the downtime to do some hunting. As he wandered the countryside, slaughtering the forest creatures, he came across a gigantic snake. The snake was big, but not big enough to be a threat to Bhima, so the hero got a little too close, and the snake pounced, coiling around Bhima's arms, pinning him down. What Bhima hadn't realized was that this was a magic snake, and anyone who got in its grasp was instantly rendered paralyzed. Bhima was still able to speak, so he introduced himself to the snake and asked the snake what kind of trick it used to capture the killer of countless Rakshasas so easily. The snake gasped and hissed in private delight. He said, "How lucky that the gods sent me such a fat specimen when I was starving. Since you have obligingly volunteered to be my supper, I'll tell you my story. I wasn't always a snake. I ticked off some sages and they cursed me to live in this condition." The snake declared that he had once been the ascetic king Nahusha, who also happened to be one of Bhima's ancestors. It turned out that Nahusha was the son of Ayu, the 5th monarch of the lunar dynasty. He had been a devoted king in those ancient days, and through study and austerities he had total command of the Vedas. Through his power and merit, Nahusha became a world emperor. In his pride, he hired only Brahmins to carry out even the most menial tasks. One day, he was out riding in a litter carried by 1,000 Brahmins, and he jogged by the sage Agastya. You'll recall that Agastya was an irritable fellow. He cursed Kubera and Manamat, and earlier we heard the story of how he ate and digested the demon Vatapi. Well, Agastya didn't take kindly to the spectacle of so many Brahmins debased in this way, so he laid a curse on King Nahusha, turning him into a giant hungry snake. The king accepted his punishment, but asked the sage when he might be set free from the curse. Agastya said the spell would only be lifted if someone could answer certain questions correctly. As for the trick he used to capture Bhima, the snake said that the Brahmins had taken pity on him and had allowed that, on every 6th attempt at catching food, he would always succeed, no matter how strong the prey. Bhima consoled his captor. He said, "Don't worry about me. Many factors in one's life are out of our control. Since I cannot escape, I accept my fate. I only regret that I cannot help my brothers to recover what was taken from them, and that my young brothers will lose their protector, and my mother will never see me victorious over my enemies. Other than that, though, I'm okay with it." Meanwhile, back at the camp, Yudhishthira had a bad sense of foreboding. He heard a jackal in the distance and saw a one-eyed, one-winged, one-footed quail spit blood. A hot, dry wind blew up from the south, and his right arm started to ache. He went to Draupadi and asked, "Where's Bhima?" Draupadi always knew where Bhima was, so she told him Bhima had gone hunting. Taking charge, Yudhishthira ordered Arjun to protect Draupadi and sent the twins to the Brahmins, and then set out on his own to find Bhima. Finding Bhima wasn't so difficult, because he had a habit of knocking down trees and trampling wildlife wherever he went. So the king followed the trail of destruction until he came upon his brother, encoiled by the giant snake. I guess the snake was in no great hurry, because it allowed Yudhishthira to ask Bhima how he got in this trouble, and Bhima replied with the whole story of Nahusha. Yudhishthira then addressed the snake, saying, "Ask what you please, snake, and I shall give the answers if I can." The snake asked, "Who is a Brahmin?" The king replied, "He is a Brahmin in whom truthfulness, patience, self-control, and compassion are found. A true Brahmin may gain knowledge of the Supreme Brahman beyond happiness and unhappiness, after which they grieve no more." The snake objected, "If you judge a Brahmin by his conduct, then birth has no meaning." Yudhishthira then pointed out that in this confused, topsy-turvy world, you can't really be sure who anyone's real parents were, so all one could go by was whether one acted like their purported caste. The snake was delighted with Yudhishthira's answer and said, "You are truly a wise man. How could I devour your brother now?" Yudhishthira realized that the snake was no slouch either, so he asked some questions that had been bothering him lately. King Dharma asked him, "How should one perceive the rewards of heaven? And what is the significance of one's actions while embodied in this lifetime?" The snake answered, "There are 3 ways one can go as a result of one's own actions. These 3 are human birth, time in heaven, or birth as an animal." The snake went on to explain that one attains heaven by acts of charity and good intentions. One is reborn as an animal if one is controlled by anger, is violent, or greedy. Animals eventually are reborn as humans. Cows and horses became deities in the next life, presumably for their good service to men. Yudhishthira then wanted to know more about the soul. He wondered, if the soul is everywhere and pervades all things, then how does it focus on the actions of a single being? How is it that an infinite can embody a finite creature? The snake said, "When the soul substance has taken possession of a body, it enjoys the experiences of the body's senses. It is by means of the mind that the soul is able to focus its attention to the embodied individual and limit awareness to the body's senses. The soul is lodged between the eyebrows, and from there initiates awareness out to the various objects. After awareness follows experience." The snake asked Yudhishthira what he thought was the nature of the soul. Yudhishthira was so excited to talk with this sage snake that he apparently forgot his brother had nearly been killed. He said, "You are truly a great soul. Why would you ask me what I think about this? And how did you fall so low as to become a snake?" The snake replied, "No matter how wise or strong you may be, wealth will confound you. I was drunk with power, and thus I fell. But now you have lifted a grievous curse with your wise conversation. Back when I used to cruise around in heaven in my Brahmin mobile, I was so full of pride that I thought of no one else. I had 1,000 Brahmins carrying me around. One time Agastya was busy carrying me, and I kicked him with my foot. That was what caused my downfall. As I fell to the ground, I begged him to put a limit on my time as a snake, and he said, 'Yudhishthira, the Dharma Raja shall free you from your curse.' The snake released Bhima, thanked the brothers, and then shed his snake body while his soul ascended to heaven. The brothers then returned to the camp and told them all what had happened. Draupadi was delighted that her husband had been rescued, but the Brahmins at the camp lectured Bhima, telling him he should not have been hunting and causing so much destruction in the first place. The Brahmins were never happy to see their patrons out killing God's creatures. The group then moved on to the banks of the Sarasvati River, by whose cool waters they spent the summer. With the cooler weather of autumn, the party once again moved, this time heading back to the Kanyaka forest. The Kanyaka forest is the place where the Pandavas began their exile, and not long after settling down, Krishna showed up, riding in his chariot and accompanied by his number 1 wife, Satyabhama. Krishna expressed his joy that Arjun had accomplished his mission, and once again complained about how the Kauravas had stolen their birthright. Krishna then turned to Draupadi to give her news of her sons. Considering that the boys had been sent to live with Krishna at the start of the exile, and that the exile had lasted over 10 years, these boys must have been teenagers by this time. Krishna assured her that he, Satyabhama, and Rukmini treated them as if they were their own children. Krishna's heroic son Pradyumna was their elder brother and mentor, and together they were all studying warfare. Furthermore, King Drupad had endowed each of his grandsons with their own lands and titles. Krishna then once again pledged his help to recover Hastinapur once the time was ripe. This time, Krishna stayed a while with the Pandavas in their camp, and while he was there, they were visited by the sages Markandeya and Narada. I'm going to stop here for now, because Markandeya has a lot of philosophy and even more stories to tell, so we'll start in on that next time. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata Podcast, Episode 37, the Markandeya Sessions, Part 1. Last time, we covered the Pandavas' trip back to where they started their exile, in the Kanyaka woods. Along the way, Bhima went hunting and was captured by a magic snake. Inexplicably, Arjun stays home while Yudhishthira goes out to save his brother. It turns out that they made the right decision, because only Yudhishthira was able to answer the snake's question and win Bhima's freedom. Yudhishthira and the snake really hit it off, and they ended up discussing all sorts of philosophical questions. I should say that the philosophy given here is not quite the same that we've heard in other parts of the book. In fact, I would characterize the snake's philosophy as more liberal or possibly modern than what we heard before. For instance, Yudhishthira takes the radical stance that one's caste is dependent more on one's actions than one's birth. As for the snake, he believed that one could attain heaven only by good actions and good intentions. He makes no mention of either austerities or sacrifices. This is a far cry from the sages like Vishvamitra, who stormed the gates of heaven by the strength of their asceticism. There's one other detail from the story of the snake that touches on something that I've been thinking about for quite a while. It has to do with the strange correlation between the 5 brothers and the 5 extremities of the human body. In the last episode, when Bhima was held captive by the snake, one of the omens Yudhishthira felt was a pain in his right arm. This rang a bell with me, because Arjun is often referred to as the left-handed archer. It seems like it really isn't much of a leap to associate the 5 brothers with the 5 extremities of an ideal man. Yudhishthira, the wise head, Bhima, the strong and aggressive right arm, Arjun, the skilled left arm, and the twins would each be a leg. The brothers may have had different fathers, but we've been told that they are each of them incarnations of Indra. Apparently, like the first man, Purusha, Indra was divided up into 5 parts to make up our 5 heroes. By the end of last episode, the Pandavas returned to the Kanyaka woods, where they had started their exile 10 years earlier. Soon after, Krishna showed up, and this time he decided to stay a while, along with his main squeeze, Satyabhama. Shortly after Krishna arrived, the sages Markandeya and Narada showed up as well. Yudhishthira, always a kiss-up to holy men, begged them for a sermon, stories, or anything else they might have to say. Markandeya's name has shown up a few times already, but like Narada, he usually wanders in, makes a speech, or delivers news, and then wanders off again. This time he had a lot to talk about. Markandeya must have been an awkward fellow, because there seems to have been an awkward silence when he settled down. Narada tried to get the ball rolling by saying to Markandeya, "Tell the Pandavas what you wish to tell them, Brahman seer." Markandeya replied, "Then sit back, because I have much to say." He then went silent again. Feeling uncomfortable, Yudhishthira then attempted to prime the pump. He said, "Sir, you are familiar with the exploits of the gods, daityas, sages, and kings. Right now, Devaki's son is here too, and we've waited a long time to hear you." The Pandava then riffed on a subject that no self-respecting Hindu would fail to be interested in. He said, "When I look at my situation, where I have fallen so low while the Dhartarashtras are prospering, the thought occurs to me that man is the agent of all acts, for good or for evil, and that he reaps his reward. So how can God act on anyone? Is it true that one's good and evil actions follow him from life to life? How is it that after a soul has shed its body, its past actions can follow it to its next life, and where are all these actions recorded?" It will remain to be seen whether Markandeya actually manages to answer all of these intriguing questions, but it was certainly enough to get him started. He started in first by giving a sort of spiritual history of mankind. The sage said that in the beginning, all creatures were immaculately pure and obedient to Dharma. They traveled freely through heaven and on earth. The ancients all chose when to die and could live forever if they wanted to. They lived freely with fulfilled and healthy lives. In the course of time, however, men lost sight of heaven and the divine beings. They became tied to the earth realm, were beset by lust, fear, and anger, and lived by deceit. After a wicked life, they were reborn as animals. Thus tied down by their evil ways, they lost their faith and continued to be reborn in misery. Markandeya said, "You asked me where one's actions are recorded, and how can they affect you in the next life. First of all, know this. At the end of life, the soul abandons the body and is instantly reborn in another womb. There is no intermission. His actions follow him like a shadow, and their influence affects his development and prospects." Markandeya then began to spell out what one might expect in their next life based on their overall lifestyle. He said that if one lives a mediocre but upright life, plays by the rules, stays clean, and is generally kind, honest, and generous, then you can expect to be reborn in a noble family with good prospects. You would then have a chance of re-entering heaven by the end of that life. Markandeya said, "People with great wealth enjoy themselves daily. They own this world, but not the next. Those who practice yoga and study the Vedas have given up this world, but the next world will be theirs. As for householders who live by their dharma, earning a living honestly, have children, and perform their rites, they win this world and the next. Finally, those people who do not bother to study or improve themselves, and fail to beget children, this world is not theirs, nor is the next. The Pandavas loved hearing about this stuff. They begged Markandeya to tell more about Brahmins. Markandeya replied with a short anecdote about a king who was out hunting and accidentally shot and killed a Brahmin ascetic who was clad in a deerskin. The king and his followers repentantly searched for their victim's relatives and finally came across a Brahmin hermit named Rshyashrnga. The king confessed to this sage that he had accidentally killed the hermit's son. The hermit then asked him to produce the body, but the king's servant suddenly couldn't find it. The Brahmin then summoned his son and asked, "Is this the one you were looking for?" The king and his retinue were all stunned at the sight of the boy, returned from the dead. The king asked the hermit how this was possible. Tarksha said, "Death holds no power over us. The reason for this is that we only think of the truth. We are devoted to our dharma, and therefore we do not fear death." This story was way too short to satisfy the Pandavas, so they demanded more Brahmin stories. Markandeya's next story involved two Brahmins. One of them, named Atri, was a city dweller with a keen interest in receiving gifts from kings. The other, named Gautama, was a fastidious ascetic who lived in the wilderness. One day, the local king began preparations for an Ashvamedha horse sacrifice. This was bound to be a spectacle as well as a financial opportunity for the local Brahmins, so both Atri and Gautama were in attendance. The place was crawling with Brahmins, so Atri needed to do something to get the king's attention. When the king was in earshot, Atri stood up and shouted, "Sire, great king, you are first among all the kings of the earth and master of Dharma." Gautama was annoyed at Atri's bald-faced attempt at flattering the king, so he shouted him down, saying, "Sit down and be quiet. Have you gone soft in the head? Only Indra stands first before all creatures." The two began arguing and causing a disturbance in the ritual proceedings. The king hadn't even heard Atri's lame attempt at flattery, but now he took notice, as these two ascetics were messing up his sacrifice. The king summoned the two to find out the dispute and to mediate. Gautama told them what had been said, and the king handed the matter over to the wisest Sadasya to adjudicate. The withered old ascetic said, "Brahmins are allied to the Kshatriyas, and Kshatriyas are allied to Brahmins. The king is our supreme dharma and the master of his subjects. To his people, the king is Shakra and Shukra, the creator, sovereign lord, and guardian of men, all rolled into one. A king is necessary for the maintenance of law and order, which is why even the sages have entrusted power in them. Thus, the sadhu ruled in favor of the scoundrel Atri." The king was pleasantly surprised by this turn of events. He addressed Atri and said, "You had stated that I was supreme among men and equal to the gods. Therefore, I shall give you vast riches, 1,000 slave girls, 100 million in gold, and 10 loads of gold ornaments." Atri happily received the treasure, and then apparently had a change of heart. He handed the wealth over to his children, and then left for the woods to join Gautama in poverty and asceticism. Now that Markandeya was on a roll, Yudhishthira wanted to keep him going, so he made another request. "Tell us about Manu Vivashvata." Markandeya said, "There was a son of Vivashvat named Manu. He was a great sage whose power, splendor, and austerity surpassed even his father and grandfather. One time he spent 10,000 years standing on one foot, arms raised and unblinking. At the end of this session, a fish swam up to him in the nearby river and spoke to him. It said, 'My lord, I'm just a tiny fish, and I'm afraid of the big fish. The big fish always eat the small ones, and I'm terrified for my life.' Filled with compassion, the sage took the little fish out of the river and put him in a jar, where he kept it and fed it and loved it like a son. Soon the fish grew too big for the jar, so Manu put it in a pond, where the fish continued to grow larger. After a while, the fish was too big for the pond, so he was transferred to the Ganga River. He continued to thrive there and eventually grew too huge to turn around even in the mighty river. Again, the fish begged Manu for help. This time, he requested to be moved to the ocean. Manu was a powerful guy, so even moving this enormous creature was no problem for him. Markandeya said that to Manu the fish was easy to carry and pleasant to touch and smell. When he tossed the beast into the ocean, it turned and spoke to Manu. It said, "Soon, my lord, everything on earth will be destroyed, for the time is near for the cleansing of the earth. You must build an ark and load up the 7 sages, plus all the seeds of all the creatures should be put in the ark. Then wait for me here. When I come back, I'll be wearing a horn on my forehead." It doesn't say whether the fish went off and grew this horn for the purpose, or if he just stuck one on like a hat, but he was true to his word. Manu built his ark as instructed, and somehow collected all the seeds and the 7 sages and launched the boat out into the ocean. While the boat floated among the ocean waves, a giant inundation swept over the earth and drowned all the land. Manu then telepathically called on his fish friend, and the fish rose up out of the waves, wearing a giant horn on his forehead, just like he promised. The fish told Manu to sling a rope around the horn, and by means of this line, he towed the ark across the sea. After years of sailing, the waters gradually receded until the highest peaks of the Himalayas were finally above the water. The fish then towed the ship to this tiny spot of land and had them moor the ship there. Manu thanked the fish for having guided them through the storm, and then the fish made a confession. It said, "I am Brahma, the lord of all creatures. In the guise of a fish I saved you from danger. Now it is up to Manu to create all the creatures, the gods, the asuras, and men." Perhaps anxious to get back to his original blissful form, the fish then vanished. The fish was in a little too much of a hurry, though, because it turned out that Manu had no idea how to create all these beings from the piles of mysterious seeds he had in his boat. Unsure how to proceed, the old sadhu turned to the tricks that had helped him in the past. He starved himself and performed yoga until he finally figured out what to do. We are not told what revelation he had, so we only know that Manu finally figured out how to create all the plants, animals, gods, and spirits, and then he proceeded to do just. Markandeya called that story the Purana of the Fish. It obviously bears some kind of relationship with the stories of Gilgamesh and Noah, but with far less details. I do like the added touch in that the ark only carries some kind of seeds from which all life forms could be regenerated. It sounds like some kind of DNA or sperm bank, and it makes a lot more sense than trying to cram the boat with thousands of varieties of livestock, which is what poor Noah had to do. It seems like we get different calculations of the length of each yuga, depending on the source. If Markandeya is correct, and if we accept the common dating for the start of the Kali Yuga at Krishna's death, then we can rest easy in the knowledge that the last Kali Yuga ended centuries ago, and we are all enjoying the next cycle's golden age. Markandeya's next story involves another king of Ayodhya. Like the last one we met, Parikshit, this one is also a descendant of Ikshvaku, named Kuvalashva. Yudhishthira specifically asked to hear the story of how King Kuvalashva came to be known as Dundamara, or the slayer of Dundu. This story begins with a Brahmin named Utanka, who performed austerities at a retreat near the desert. This hermit happened to have had a bad neighbor, a Danava named Dundu. Dundu lived in the desert under the ground and occasionally came up to make trouble by blowing up big sandstorms. One day, the god Vishnu came to Utanka in person and explained that this Dundu had acquired the special boon that no god or supernatural creature could ever destroy him. This should have been enough to assure Dundu's protection, because no mortal human could possibly overpower this mighty creature. Vishnu had a plan, however. He told Utanka to seek out the prince of Ayodhya and instruct this Kshatriya to take down Dundu. Utanka did as he was told and left his hermitage for the kingdom of Ayodhya. There he found Kuvalashva, newly crowned king by his father, who had retired to the forest. Utanka met with Kuvalashva and explained to him the trouble with Dundu and Vishnu's offer of assistance. He told the king that Vishnu would endow him with the god's powers if he would take on the task. Kuvalashva agreed, but then asked for more details about his opponent. Utanka explained that Dundu's parents were powerful demons who had been around since the beginning of time. Named Madhu and Kaitaba, they were there when Brahma sprang from the lotus in Vishnu's navel. These two proud demons teased and frightened this young instance of Brahma and irritated him to such a degree that he shook the lotus, and this woke up Vishnu. Apparently, the first person Vishnu sees when he wakes up gets granted a boon, because Vishnu offered the two demons a boon. These two proud demons laughed and said, No, we are your benefactors, so you should ask us for a boon." Now, it's not good to play tricks on Vishnu, because he's pretty tricky himself. The god agreed and asked them to allow him to kill them. The demons were as good as their word, and they allowed Vishnu to kill them. This pair, however, already had a son, none other than Dundu. Dundu had a chip on his shoulder now, and, determined to make trouble, he performed intense austerities, and finally won from the gods the power of invulnerability from all gods and supernatural creatures. Having the form of something like a fire-breathing dragon, Dundu gave the finger to the gods and buried himself beneath the desert sands, blowing fire and tormenting hermits at Utanka's ashram. Now, having heard what he was up against, Kuvalashva summoned his army, as well as his 21,000 sons, and marched them off to encounter this dragon from the beginning of time. As the army set out, with the hermit Utanka at the lead, The spirit and power of Vishnu entered into Kuvalashva's body, while flowers rained from the sky, and a loud voice rang from the heavens, saying, "This majestic prince shall be called Dundamara, the slayer of Dundu." Meanwhile, Indra obligingly provided a pleasant rain shower to keep the dust down, while the other gods parked their Vamanas over Dundu's lair to watch the fight. When the army reached Dundu's lair, they spread out, surrounding the patch of earth beneath which Dundu remained in hiding. Since the beast would not come out and fight, the king then ordered his sons to dig it up. The 21,000 boys commenced the digging, and after 7 days' work, they finally uncovered the dragon. The monster was still sleeping as they uncovered it, and the king did not wait for it to wake up. He ordered the first assault immediately. The boys rushed in, as did the king and the rest of the army, attacking from all sides. The rain of spears, arrows, and warhammers finally woke the beast, and it angrily counterattacked, spewing fire in all directions. In an instant, the king's entire brood of sons were consumed by the fire. The king then resorted to his superpowers, generating a flood of divine water which extinguished the dragon's fire. He then unsheathed his Brahma weapon and sent it flying at Dundu's head. The creature was instantly beheaded and fell back into his pit, dead and defeated. While the gods celebrated up in the sky, and the powers of Vishnu returned to their master, King Kuvalashva searched the wreckage for any survivors. Out of the 21,000 sons, only 3 had survived. But this was quite enough to carry on the dynasty through the next generation, so the king was happy. Markandeya ended this story, saying, "Thus I have told you the story of Dundamara, and anyone who hears this will become devoted to Dharma and will have many sons." Yudhishthira then requested another story. This time, he wanted to hear more about the dharma of those people doomed to menial and demeaning tasks. In a surprisingly sensitive passage, Yudhishthira asked about the dharma of women. He said, "Sir, I wish to hear you tell of the greatness of women and the subtleties of women's dharma. It seems to me that a woman's duty to obey her husband must be the most difficult to perform. I do not see anything harder than trying to be constantly pleasing and obedient to one's husband, mother, and father. What is more marvelous than a woman who is devoted to her husband, speaks the truth, and carries a child for 10 months in her womb? After exposing themselves to great danger and suffering, women give birth to sons with great hardship and raise them with great love. I also wonder about men who are engaged in cruel or demeaning occupations and are despised for it, and yet they continue to perform these tasks." Markandeya said, "Some consider the mother most important, while others believe it is the father. But the mother who rears her children does a difficult thing. Fathers obtain sons by worshipping the gods, making offerings, and performing austerities. But for women, no offering, sacrifice, or austerity can help her. She attains heaven by obedience to her husband." The sage then elaborated on his point with a couple of linked stories about the devoted wife and the butcher. Not surprisingly, both stories revolve around the character of a Brahmin named Kaushika. Kaushika was a prickly fellow with a bad attitude. His adventures began one day when he was out meditating and saluting the sky. A big bird, a female heron, flew over and dumped a huge turd right on Kaushika's head. The Brahmin looked up angrily and glared at the bird, causing her heart to stop beating. The bird plunged from the sky and fell dead to the ground. Looking at the dead creature on the ground, Kaushika felt remorseful and wished he had controlled his anger better. Vowing to be more forbearing, the hermit fetched his begging bowl and left for the nearby village to beg his food. The first house he approached was occupied by a peasant family. The young peasant wife opened the door, and Kaushika demanded his alms. The woman went back into the house to fetch grain. As she was working on this, her husband entered the house, tired and hungry from working in the fields. Seeing that her husband had arrived, the woman rushed to him, washed his feet, prepared his dinner, and served him the food. She did not eat with him, and instead waited on him, planning to eat the leftovers later. Meanwhile, Kaushika was waiting for his food and was beginning to get annoyed. The thought did occur him to lay a particularly nasty curse on this young family, but then he remembered he was working on his anger management. Finally, the wife remembered the waiting mendicant, and embarrassed, she rushed back to serve him. Kaushika scolded her, saying, "What is the meaning of this? I could have gone to another house rather than wait so long." Hoping to calm the angry Brahmin, she said, "Please forgive me. My husband is my greatest god, and he came home tired and hungry, so I took care of him." The Brahmin said, "You mean Brahmins are not as important as a serf? Indra himself bows to Brahmins. "You insolent woman, don't you know that an angry Brahmin can burn up the earth?" The woman replied, "I do not mean to belittle Brahmins. I know of the power of the Brahmins. I know that because of their anger they made the ocean salty and undrinkable. I have heard how the great Asura Vatapi was digested by Agastya. Now please excuse my transgression. My dharma is to serve and obey my husband, and that is fine with me. Among all deities, my husband is my paramount god, and as a result of my devotion I have been given certain knowledge. For instance, I saw how you killed that bird in the forest, and I know that you did it out of anger. I also know that a true Brahmin controls his temper. Clearly, you can use some instruction in the subtleties of Dharma. I suggest you go to the town of Matilla and talk to the butcher there. This guy is obedient to his mother and father, is self-possessed, and speaks honestly. He can explain Dharma to you." Rather than becoming irate, Kaushika took all this to heart, and he thanked the peasant woman for her advice, and then set out for Matilla. As he wandered into Matilla's surroundings, Kaushika immediately noticed the orderly calm that exuded from the whole kingdom. He saw happy, hard-working peasants and virtuous Brahmins. As he entered the city, he marveled at the walls and battlements and the efficiency of the king's guards. All the citizens credited their good King Janaka for the good order and the virtue of the people. Kaushika then made his way to the city's meat market and found the butcher there, selling meat to an orderly crowd of citizens. Kaushika waited for the butcher to finish his transaction, but the butcher noticed the Brahmin standing there and hurried over to him. He said, "You should not be standing here. Let me take you to my home and we'll see what I can do for you." Since a Brahmin really shouldn't be hanging around in a meat market, the two hurried over to the butcher's modest but clean home. Kaushika was presented the seat of honor, and as the butcher washed his feet, Kaushika noticed how well kept the house looked, and that the butcher's elderly parents were taken care of faithfully. Kaushika said to his host, "It seems to me that your occupation is not fitting for someone as virtuous as you." The butcher replied, "Please do not be angry with me, sir. I do the job that was done by my father and his father before that. I do my best in this situation. I obey my elders, I give charity when I can, I despise nothing and hold no one in contempt. Society only functions when everyone sticks to their born profession, and this is the profession I was born to. Our King Janaka is true to his dharma, and he in turn ensures that everyone else is true to their own. He imposes justice fairly on all classes of people, and would imprison his own son if the boy behaved lawlessly. As for me, I sell meat of pigs and buffaloes, because that is my dharma. I do not, however, kill the animals, nor do I eat meat. I observe the fasts, and I honor the gods. No matter how humble our beginnings, all people can improve themselves. I must have committed sins in my past life to deserve this current occupation. I have learned that if one remembers their past misdeeds, you need only repent of those actions and you are freed of the sin. Since my misdeeds were in a past life, I do not recall what it was I did wrong. The way one is cleansed of the sins of prior lives is to live by your dharma in this life." Kaushik was delighted by this butcher's philosophizing, and he had many questions about good conduct and the nature of karma and the senses. I'll spare you all the details, because it is standard Hindu fare, which I'm sure you've heard before. When their dialogue completed, Kaushika praised his host, saying, "It was my great fortune that I met you today. I shall take your words to heart, and I will go home to care for my parents. But first, please tell me, how did you end up a butcher? Dharma is normally a mystery to a commoner, but you are a true master." The butcher then confessed that he may have been born a commoner this lifetime, but that in his previous life he was a Brahmin, born to an important family. He was friends with the king, and they would practice archery together. One day, the pair went out hunting, and the Brahmin's arrow accidentally struck a sadhu. As the pair rushed to the sadhu's side, the hermit cried out, "You've killed an innocent man. For your crime you shall be born a serf and the son of a butcher." Our protagonist begged for mercy. He said, "I didn't mean to do this. Please forgive me, my lord." The sadhu replied, "The curse cannot be changed, but my natural kindness compels me to do you this one favor. Although you will be born a serf, you will be wise in the ways of Dharma, and you will be devoted and obedient to your mother and father. You will retain your memories of your past lives and will earn great merit. When the curse has expired, you shall again be born a Brahmin." Fortunately, the arrow was removed from the hermit, and the old guy survived. The butcher was still condemned to life as a commoner, but at least he was freed from the crime of killing a holy man. That's all for now. This also pretty much wraps up the Markandeya stories. Next time, we'll get back to our heroes, but we'll stay on the subject of women's dharma, as Draupadi and Krishna's wife Satyabhama have a talk on how they please the men in their lives. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata Podcast, episode 40, The Cattle Expedition. Last episode consisted of 2 more stories that Markandeya told to the Pandavas, Krishna, and Satyabhama his wife. The first story was another rousing battle story, with the heroic king Dundamara slaying a dragon from the beginning of time. Markandeya's second story took a more sensitive and thoughtful turn, as Yudhishthira asked him to illustrate the dharma of women and people who perform demeaning tasks. The sage turns the tables in this story, in which the 2 protagonists are a peasant wife and a butcher. The person whom they educate is a Brahmin, Kaushika. In this modern age, most of us have at least some degree of freedom in the occupations we choose. This was obviously not the case back in the time our story was composed. In a well-ordered city like ancient Ayodhya, everyone inherited their occupation from their father. This was called jati, as opposed to caste or varna, which refers to the more broad categories of Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. I'm sure that in some instances, it was kind of nice to inherit your father's business and not to worry about competitors coming in from other industries and breaking into your markets. For most people, like the latrine cleaners and tanners, I'm sure it was stifling and oppressive to be forced into the family's occupation. On the other hand, I think India came up with a beautiful answer to this problem with their concept of dharma. If you're going to be stuck doing a loathsome job, you might as well make the best of it. I'm sure the idea of reincarnation also offered some consolation, in that you knew even a lifetime of shoveling shit wasn't really a very long time in the big scheme of things. Getting back to our story, Markandeya was still expounding on Hindu mythology. To be honest, I simply couldn't make much of a narrative out of these stories, because they seem to be only bits and pieces of larger stories that are not told here. This final Markandeya session is in a single chapter called Angiras. Angiras was one of those divine Brahmins who acted as priest to the gods. He was father to Brihaspati, if you remember him. These fragmentary stories involve feuds among the gods and battles between Indra and the Asuras. It appears that while Markandeya was reciting these convoluted mythologies, the women in his audience also grew bored, and eventually Draupadi and Krishna's wife Satyabhama slipped out to have a more private conversation. The pair regaled each other with stories from their respective families, until Satyabhama changed the subject. She asked Draupadi, "How do you pull this off? Your men are all gallant and powerful. How do you keep them happy? You can tell me. Do you drug them? Is there some magic you use to control them? Please tell me your secret, whatever it is, so I may better please my husband Krishna." Draupadi was a little annoyed at the implication of her question and said, "Only wanton women do things like that. You should have enough sense to know that when a woman uses spells or drugs on her husband, and the husband finds out, he fears her more than a viper. No man has been improved with a spell, plus the potions women use tend to make their men impotent, deaf, and blind. I'll tell you what I do. I serve the Pandavas and their wives religiously and without selfishness. No other man could please me, be he god or Gandharva, young, rich, or handsome. When my husband comes home from work, I get up to greet him and make him feel welcome with a seat and a drink. My kitchen is clean and my cooking is good. I avoid laughing or nagging too much, and I do not gossip. When my husband is away, I go without makeup or jewelry until he comes back. My dharma is my husband. He is God, he is my religion. I do not sleep more than them, nor do I eat more, nor talk more than they. I never complain about my mother-in-law, no matter how aggravated I get. I care for my mother-in-law daily. I bathe her, dress her, and feed her. In matters of clothes, jewelry, and food, she has the final word, and I do not argue." Draupadi then described in detail how she managed the king's household back at Indraprastha. She personally greeted their thousands of Brahmin guests, managed the vast kitchens, and directed the many thousands of servants. Draupadi concluded her tirade, saying, "I am the first up in the morning and the last to sleep, and all that you see is my magic spell. Yes, I know how to cast spells, but I would never consider doing such a thing." Satyabhama said, "Sheesh, I was only trying to make a joke." Draupadi then even got more serious and advised Satyabhama on how to specifically keep Krishna from wandering off with the other ladies. She said, "There is no other god like your husband is to you. If you please him, you shall have anything you wish for, but if you anger him, you will suffer. A devoted wife gets children, wealth, and comfort in this life, and heaven in the next. To keep Krishna's attention, cook him tasty dishes, make beautiful garlands, wear sweet perfumes, and keep a clean house. Send the servants away and do the chores yourself. Krishna will surely get the message. Whatever he may say to you, even if not a secret, keep it secret anyway. Be welcoming to your husband's friends, and do not talk to his enemies. If he gets drunk, control your temper and do not scold him. And that, Draupadi said, is the whole secret to making sure your husband does not stray off into someone else's bed. Getting back to the menfolk, Markandeya finally finished up with his mythology, and Krishna found a good opportunity to wrap up this visit. He got up, summoned his wife, and mounted his chariot to leave. As Satyabhama went to join her husband, she turned to Draupadi and said, "Do not fret, you will soon win the earth when your divine husbands have taken it back. No woman as good and faithful as you can suffer misfortune for long. When the Dhartarashtras have all been killed, you will see the women who laughed at your exile bereft of their pride. Do not worry about your sons either. Prativindya, Sutasoma, Shrutakarma, Shatanika, and Shrutasena are all great warriors and are thriving in Dvarka along with Abhimanyu. They are loved and cared for by everyone in our palace, so do not worry on their account." With these words, Krishna and his people set off for home, leaving the Pandavas once more in their forest exile. Now that our heroes were back in the plains of India, they were more accessible to the holy men who made their rounds from palace to pilgrimage. Thus, a regular stream of visitors passed through the Pandavas' camp. It wasn't long before sadhus appeared at the court of Hastinapur with the latest news from the Pandavas in exile. It was in that way that Dhritarashtra was told how Arjun had returned from heaven with these tremendous weapons, and then quietly settled down with his brothers to wait out the end of the exile. Considering that Arjun was packing enough heat to finish the job immediately, it only tormented the king even further to know that this revenge would be served up cold. It seems like a long time since we last heard from the bad guys of Hastinapur, so Dhritarashtra's subsequent lament helps to remind us how he got here. When the Brahmin finished telling the court about the Pandavas, Dhritarashtra began one of his famous laments. Feeling pity for his nephews, the blind king wept and blamed himself for their suffering and loss. Weeping over the fact that his adopted sons, who had been raised in palaces, were now sleeping on the ground with no roof over their heads, Dhritarashtra's mind veered to feelings of guilt over what he had allowed to happen. Guilt then transmogrified into fear. He recalled the cruel words of his son Dushasan, saying, when they had been tricked into losing the dice match, Dushasan's words must have pierced Bhima's belly and burned his guts like fire. I know Yudhishthira is self-possessed, and Arjun practices self-control, but Bhima's anger must be nearly uncontrollable. Duryodhana, Shakuni, Karna, and Dushasan must all be idiots, thinking only of short-term gains, and forgetting the inevitable disaster yet to come. It was wrong to cheat the Pandavas at dice, but I too did wrong by going along with my sons and their... Arjun went bodily to the highest heaven, and he could have stayed there for eternity, frolicking with the Apsaras. But instead of that, he came back here to live in a shithole with his brothers. There can only be one explanation for that: bloody revenge. While Dhritarashtra was thus lamenting, his eldest son Duryodhana and Duryodhana's uncle Shakuni were nearby, listening in. The pair then nervously called a meeting of their cronies. The meeting was convened with Duryodhana, Shakuni, Dushasan, and Karna. Karna began. He said, "Why all the long faces? What are you guys worried about? I mean, look at you. You are king of the world. All the nations of India send you tribute, and their vast armies will march on your command. You could travel to the 4 directions and never come across a single enemy worthy of your prowess. The world is made up entirely of your slaves and well-wishers. The only exceptions are those 5 hobos living in the woods by the shore of Lake Dvaitavana. You should be happy, because your only opponents are thoroughly defeated. What greater joy is there than to stand on a hill and see your enemies downtrodden below? What do you say we go down there to watch them, living in holes in the ground, eating dirt? We'll bring our girlfriends along so they can get a good laugh looking at Draupadi in her tree bark outfit." Duryodhana giggled lasciviously at the thought of it, but then became downcast once more. He said, "That sounds wonderful, and I'd love to do it, but I just saw my father weeping and moping about those losers. There's no way he'd let us do that." Later that night, Shakuni came up with a plan. So the next day, while Duryodhana and the king and Bhishma were sitting at court, they arranged for a cowherd to present himself. The cowherd announced to the court that the king's cattle in the hill stations were all rounded up and ready for collection. Karna and Shakuni then volunteered to lead the expedition. When the king approved this, Karna cloyingly suggested that perhaps Prince Duryodhana should come along and enjoy some hunting along the way. At first, old Dhritarashtra was pretty happy with the idea. After some thought, however, he said, "Wait a minute. Those cattle outposts are right next door to where the Pandavas are staying. Are you guys planning on some sort of shenanigan? I don't want you going out there without some kind of chaperone to keep an eye on you." On cue, Shakuni stood up to vouch for the venture. He offered to watch over the boys, and besides, he said, the Pandavas know their dharma, so they would never get mixed up in a fight, and we are only talking about a little hunting and a little collecting, that's all. With Duryodhana's uncle there to vouch for them, the king reluctantly agreed to allow the mission. Eagerly looking forward to having some fun at the Pandavas' expense, Duryodhana summoned his 100 brothers, an army of retainers, thousands of women, 8,000 chariots, 30,000 elephants, plus a regiment of foot soldiers and cavalry, and a city's worth of merchants, cooks, cleaners, and whores. At the head of the sprawling rabble, Duryodhana led them into the woods. As the force made its way, they performed their cattle-collecting duties, and the princes were feasted and entertained at every stop along the way. As they neared the lake, however, scouts reported back that the region was occupied by a well-armed tribe of Gandharvas. The king of the Gandharvas had established the area around the lake as his camp, so Duryodhana haughtily sent a runner to the Gandharvas, announcing his approach and ordering them to clear out of the area. Now, you may recall that Gandharvas are supernatural beings, and mortals really shouldn't mess with these guys. Duryodhana, however, wasn't so wise. When the Gandharva chieftain refused to clear out, the prince reacted angrily, ordering his soldiers, "Punish those churls, run them out of these woods." The Kaurava forces armed themselves and made their formation at the entrance to the woods. The attack seemed to go well at first. The Gandharvas put up a moderate resistance, but their defenses soon collapsed and Duryodhana's army rushed into the woods. Thinking he had routed his foes, the prince ordered all of his forces to pursue the enemy. Once the entire army had entered the forest, they soon discovered it had all been a trap. The Gandharvas closed in behind them and flanked the army from all sides. This was the moment the Gandharvas revealed that they could fly. Suddenly, the prince and his cronies were fighting for their lives. Even in this desperate situation, Karna was no slouch. He fired arrows in all directions and slaughtered Gandharvas by the thousands. The only problem was that Gandharvas don't need to go through the whole rebirth process after they die. They simply reincarnated back into their original warrior form and resumed fighting. While the battle was raging, the Gandharva king, Chitrasena, sent in reinforcements and soon joined in the melee. The tide quickly turned in favor of the Gandharvas, and the army was overrun and surrendering. Making a last stand, Karna positioned his chariot in front of his prince and began to fight for his life. Now, having him completely surrounded, the Gandharvans fired arrows into Karna's chariot, breaking it into pieces. They also shot off his armor and helmet, and finally knocked the bow from his hands. Karna and Duryodhana were completely overrun, and finally forced to surrender, along with what remained of his army. Meanwhile, Duryodhana's mob of camp followers had stayed behind, and watched from a distance as the army was utterly decimated. Traumatized and frightened, these remnants of Duryodhana's pleasure cruise went looking for the Pandavas for help. The camp followers threw themselves at Yudhishthira's feet and begged for his help and protection. At first, Bhima was satisfied to see Duryodhana reap the consequences of his folly. But this soon turned to annoyance that, if the Kauravas were killed by their captors, it would steal the Pandavas' chance of getting their own sweet revenge. Yudhishthira scolded his brother. He said, "Don't be so harsh, now that they have come to grief and have come to us for help. Do you know the law in this matter? There may be conflicts and fights within a family, but when the family is attacked by an outsider, the whole family must close ranks and fight him as one. This Gandharva has kidnapped our cousin and has harassed his women. This is an insult to our family, and we shall avenge it. Arjun, the twins, and yourself shall take up arms and set your cousin free. Any Kshatriya worth his spit would run to help someone who came to him for protection." Arjun was probably just happy to have the chance to shed blood again. He said, "If they do not free the Kauravas, then the earth shall drink their blood." I think another reason Arjun might have been excited was that these Gandharvas were supernatural, which meant he'd get a chance to try out his magic weapons of mass destruction. The warriors all cheered Arjun, and the small force rode out to face the flying Gandharvas. Arjun called out to the opposing force. He said, "The Dharma Raja requests that you free the sons of Dhritarashtra and their wives immediately." A Gandharva replied, "Friend, we take orders from only one person on earth, and he isn't you." Arjun said, "If you do not release my cousins, then I shall free them myself." At that, the assault began, with the Gandharvas flitting around and arrows flying in all directions. Since the Gandharvas had resorted to magic by flying around, Arjun retaliated with his own magical weapons. Reaching into the collection he had retrieved from the gods, he pulled out the Agneya weapon and fired it into the air, causing 1,000,000 Gandharvas to fall out of the sky. Soon, the brothers were having difficulty just dodging the falling body parts. The enemy did not let up their attack, so Arjun pulled out his Shtunakarna, Indrajala, Sara, and Samya missiles and sent them flying in all directions. Now the Gandharvan king Chitrasena entered the fray. Seeing that the main threat came from Arjun, he went after that hero with his club. Arjun, using bear hunting arrows, was able to knock that weapon into pieces. Chitrasena then made himself invisible, but Arjun used echolocation and was able to smoke him out and continued with his attack. Discretion being the better part of valor, Chitrasena called off the attack and made himself visible before the brothers. Arjun called out to him, "Why have you kidnapped our cousins and their wives in this fashion?" Chitrasena replied, "Our scouts had informed us that these wicked people had come in force to these woods for the purpose of mocking you and your good wife. The king of the gods himself told me to come, arrest the Kauravas, and protect you while you're in exile." Arjun replied, "Then set them free. Duryodhana is our brother. This is Dharmaraja's request." Chitrasena said, "He is wicked and corrupt and does not deserve freedom. He has cheated you, and Yudhishthira doesn't know what he was planning to do to you. But if you still want him released, then very well." By now Yudhishthira had come along, and he thanked Chitrasena for not having harmed the Kauravas and requested that they be set free. Meanwhile, Indra swooped overhead, dropping Amrit over the battlefield, thus reviving all the fallen combatants. Yudhishthira then addressed the Kauravas, scolding them for picking fights needlessly, and then dismissed them. Duryodhana and his cronies shamefully returned home, tails between their legs. That's all for now. Next time we'll see how Duryodhana reacts to this shameful defeat and rescue. Thanks for listening.